Um, Good evening and welcome to tonight's Bengal Club Library event, which is Professor Satvinder Singh Juss talking on his new book, The Execution of Bhagat Singh, Legal Heresies of the Raj. As is well known, in 1928, Bhagat Singh plotted with others to kill the police chief responsible for the death of Lala Lajpat Rai, one of the founders of National College, during a silent march opposing the Simon Commission. Instead, in a case of mistaken identity, junior officer J.P. Saunders was killed, and Bhagat Singh had to flee Lahore to escape the death penalty. In 1929, he and an associate lobbed a bomb at the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi to protest the implementation of the Defense of India Act, and he then surrendered. He was hanged at the age of 23 for the murder of Saunders. Now, Professor Juss is an expert in constitutional practice, human rights, and refugee law, focusing particularly on policy-oriented work. He was born and raised in colonial East Africa, Tanganyika, now Tanzania, in 1958, during the time of the Mau Mau independence movement. He is a professor of law at King's College London and a barrister-at-law at Gray's Inn. He's published widely on the subjects of migration and human rights law. Let me just briefly read two extracts from two reviews of his book. Excuse me, from the Tribune. After reading the book, you will soon forget the details of the narrative, but not the epochal portrayal of Bhagat Singh on the cover, nor his efforts and those of his companions who tried to make, within quotes, the deaf hear by embracing martyrdom, an event that we as a nation casually acknowledge and so easily forget. The print dotted. The colonial British administration used controversial legislative powers to convict Indian revolutionary Bhagat Singh to death, which were never approved by the Central Legislative Assembly in India nor the British Parliament. A new book titled The Execution of Bhagat Singh, Legal Heresies of the Raj, by London-based law professor Dr. Satvinder Singh Juss, debunks the myth that the British Raj introduced the rule of law in colonial India by looking at Bhagat Singh's legal trial. Before I hand over to the professor, may I request you all to type your questions in the chat box during the course of his talk, and I will ask some of those at the end. Please do keep the questions short. Thank you very much. Over to you, Satvinder.
Well, thank you very much for those very warm words of introduction. It is, of course, a pleasure and a privilege to be invited to speak at the Bengal Club, the oldest social club and the most prestigious in India. But that's not the only reason why I feel so privileged. I feel privileged because the subject of my talk today, the Bhagat Singh and his Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, cannot be discussed without a reference to people like Bengali revolutionaries, such as Jogesh Chandra Chatterjee, Sachindranath Sanyal, who actually Bhagat Singh fell under the spell of when he was a student at the National College in Lahore. Actually met him. And Jatinder Das, who is an extremely bright first-class graduate student who died on a hunger strike and is well commemorated in Delhi, because these and members of the Anushilan Samiti worked together hand in hand with the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army as underground groups that were spread right across India, United Provinces, Punjab, Bengal, coordinating their activities together. And so this is a really important tradition or facet of the Indian revolutionary struggle that lies forgotten. And it lies forgotten for this reason. The predominant narrative is that it's really Gandhian non-cooperation, non-violent movement that brought us Indian freedom. And that this is the triumph of Gandhian ideology over non-violence. And it quite forgets that alongside it, in tandem, hand in hand, was a revolutionary movement. And that's completely forgotten. It's been totally sidelined. I mean, the old idea that history or victory belongs to the winners, to the victors, is a case in point here. That had this other group won, then it would have been they who would have been saying that largely due to our efforts to eject the colonial rule, we succeeded, and it wasn't the nonviolent movement. So I think the two traditions are really important to bear in mind, and the two traditions don't meet. There is the urban, highly educated, often foreign educated elite calling for independence. And alongside, there are the indigenous land-based organizations that are agitating for freedom. And the two really need to be taken together. That's my first point. My second point is this, really, that it's important to put this in perspective, because by the 1920s, Gandhi had actually largely withdrawn from agitational politics. And he was dismayed by the outbreaks of violence in his non-cooperation movement. The classic illustration of that is, of course, the Chauri Chaura massacre. This was a massacre in February 1922, when in Uttar Pradesh, in a place called Chauri Chaura, there is a non-violent protest taking place against high prices, food prices. And they're all Gandhians, they're all non-violent. And what happens is that the police attacks them. It attacks them, it then arrests their leaders, and it jails them. That's on the 2nd of February. On the 4th of February, 2 days later, the protesters decide actually to do a second protest in the marketplace. When they go to the marketplace, they're shot at by the British people. Angrily, they descend upon the Chauri Chaura police station and they set it alight. It burns and 23 police officers are burned to death. Gandhi is absolutely aghast and mortified by this, and immediately calls off the entire nonviolent movement without any consultation with the governing committee of the Congress Party. Now, again, this is something that's been forgotten, not talked about, and yet it's so important, so powerful, because as recently as 2019, the Times of India wrote about this, and the Times of India said that this atrocity of the British shooting unarmed people might well have remained forgotten as another aspect of the freedom struggle, just like Jallianwala Bagh, had it not been for the fact that in calling off this non-violent struggle just at the time when it was beginning to work, what Gandhi did was that he, quote, disavowed the peasants who rose up in his name, unquote. Now, Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel and Rajendra Prasad, the first president of India, they go along with this quite unhappily because Gandhi is such a huge man of stature. But there are people who are also very, very unhappy with this. Chitranjan Das is extremely unhappy. And in fact, Jawaharlal's father, Motilal, also dissents from this decision to call off the non-violent struggle, and because they felt let down. Now, the biggest disenchantment and displeasure is expressed by the figure that Rajesh Mukherjee mentioned, Lala Lajpat Rai. He says this, he says, quote, our defeat, that's the defeat on having called this off, our defeat is in proportion to the greatness of our leader. Why do I mention all of this? Well, because what then happens is this, that people start breaking away from the Gandhian nonviolent creed in their droves. So the very people that have become known as revolutionary, Sukhdev, who was hanged with Bhagat Singh, Shiv Verma, who was in jail with him, Bhagwati Charan Vora, who actually wrote the manifesto of the Hindustan Socialist Republic Association, Jaidev Kapoor, and the man I've just mentioned right at the beginning, Jogesh Chandra Chatterjee, Jatin Das, Chandrasekhar Azad, all of them break away and join the revolutionary movement. Across India in the early 1920s, you have the rise, the emergence of temporary safe houses, temporary bomb factories, and shifting weapon holds. And this is how this alternative tradition begins to take off in a big way. And the truth of the matter is this, that by calling off the non-violent movement in February 1922, Gandhi struggles thereafter to have non-violence as the accepted ideology of the Congress Party. He actually struggles. And it's true that he described Bhagat Singh as a quote unquote deluded patriot, but Bhagat Singh equally described him as a man wedded to quote utopian nonviolence. Utopian means idealistic, and there it was. His non-violence idea did not work for Bhagat Singh, because in February there are these people in a peaceful march and they're shot at by the police, and non-violence therefore doesn't work. And Bhagat Singh's idea was that, look, we are not violent per se at all, but what we do is entirely dependent upon what you do to us. The actions that you take against us will determine what we do, right? And so this is how this development takes place alongside, and Gandhi struggles. And I'll end simply by saying this, that the fact that you have today the centrality of within the anti-colonial movement of non-violence is entirely due to the extraordinary stature of this one man, Mahatma Gandhi. It's entirely due to him that we take that as being the reason for our independence, rather than this alternative tradition, which we have completely forgotten. Now, that's my introduction. And I just want to say two things. What I hope to do in the next few minutes, I think 20 minutes or so, is really to emphasize 2 points, and they may be controversial, but I want to emphasize 2 points, and then we can have a discussion about it afterwards. First, is his trial, the trial of Bhagat Singh and his execution. Now, here is the book I wrote, The Execution of Bhagat Singh, now available in India, widely popular. And my own reason, I mean, being in London, both practicing as a barrister and teaching, people ask me, how on earth did I ever decide to do this? Well, easy. At the height of one summer in 2013, on my computer, zinged a message that the renowned professor of Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Chaman Lal, had written an article in the Hindu, highly respected Indian newspaper, saying that there were 130 undisclosed, undiscovered, unread files on the trial of Bhagat Singh in the Lahore archives, in the Civil Secretariat's office, that are even forbidden to Pakistani nationals to look at. And I thought, well, Satvinder, what have you got to do in your life? Nothing much. Why don't you go and have a look? And so I applied. I applied for a visa, and I went across to Pakistan, and I sat in the Lahore archives, and I went through the documents. And I can say right away that there are not 130 files, but 160 catalogued folders on the Bhagat Singh trial, all of which I've gone through. Much else remains that is actually uncatalogued, but there are 160 that I was able to come across, and many of which I've produced in the book. There are about 100 photographs of the documents there. And that has led me to throw some light on the trial. So the first thing I want to talk about is the trial, very briefly. And the second thing I want to talk about really is, why is Bhagat Singh important? What was his ideology? And should he remain as forgotten as he is? I should just say this to you, that in 1991, India Today magazine, which is the most popular English magazine, when it asked its readers, who is the greatest Indian? Back came the reply, not Subhash Chandra Bose ji or Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru, but Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh was the name that they came up with. And in Pakistan, what I found people saying was this: if there's one figure who can unite the division between India and Pakistan, it's Bhagat Singh, because he was totally non-secular, totally non-communal, totally irreligious, and rose above all these things. So let me quickly begin with the trial. First, as has been mentioned already, the Lahore conspiracy case, 1931, is perhaps the most controversial trials to have taken place in British India. It arose after Bhagat Singh was arrested on 8th April 1929 for throwing 2 smoke bombs in the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi to make the death Hare. At the time, 2 bills were being passed, the Public Safety Bill and the Trades Dispute Bill. And seated in the chamber were Motilal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Sir John Simon of the Simon Commission, and Sir Sobha Singh, the father of Khushwant Singh. Police investigations then showed that members of the Hindustan Socialist Republic Army, which Bhagat Singh had himself set up in that year, in 1929, aged just 21 years, had the previous year in 1928 assassinated a British official by the name of J.P. Saunders, who had been mistaken for his boss, James Scott, the superintendent of the police. Scott had been in charge when the nationalist figure, Lala Lajpat Rai, arranged a demonstration of 5,000 Lahoris at Lahore railway station to protest against the Simon Commission, a 7-member commission that had arrived in India and was traveling across and had just come now to Lahore to talk about India's independence. The 7-member commission were all white people, including Clement Attlee, who was going to become the future Prime Minister of India. And Lala Lajpat Rai said, look, if our future is at stake, then we want to have at least one Indian represented. So they met them there with those that could speak English. Simon, go back. Those that could not said, Hindustani hum hai, Hindustan hamara. Mar jao Simon, jahan hai desh tumhara. You can imagine with words like that, what would happen. There was a lathi charge, and Lala Lajpat Rai was felled, and a week later he dies on the 17th November. His death gave rise to a new round of political violence. It completely transformed the political, legal landscape of India, that violence. And people were taunted, look, isn't there a man amongst you? In fact, C.R. Das's wife at C.R. Das's funeral said, isn't there a man amongst you who will avenge his death? And Bhagat Singh then rises to that and goes out with 3 other people and shoots him down. That is the only occasion of his having recourse to violence. And you can see why he's done it, because it is an act of revenge to avenge the death of Lala Lajpat Rai, whom everyone followed. He doesn't go about actually creating violence on every other occasion. In fact, in my book, right at even before the book begins, I include a statement by the Hindustan Socialist Republic Association. People have often asked me, well, what kind of a person was he really? Well, this will tell you. Here is what he says. We are sorry to admit that we who attach great sanctity to human life, we who dream of a glorious future when man will be enjoying perfect peace and full liberty, have been forced to shed human blood, unquote. So it's an act of tremendous reluctance and born out of necessity. So on the 17th of December, exactly a month after Lala Lajpat Rai dies, Bhagat Singh does the shooting and becomes immensely popular. 25 members are then charged, and their names are given in the Lahore Ordinance, and the trial runs. Now, the trial that follows allows them to denounce British authority. The proceedings are regularly reported in the Lahore-based Tribune magazine, the editor of whom is sympathetic to their cause. Congressmen rally around to support them. The defiance and bravado of the accused is showcased carefully in the newspapers, who, thou debilitated by hunger, drive rings around the magistrate. The magistrate is one who is described as a first-class magistrate by the name of Rai Sahib Pandit Sri Krishan. And he begins the trial on the 10th of July, 1929. And you can see already why and how he's becoming a household name. All the revolutionaries are. Now, one reason why the trial has remained shrouded in so much obscurity is because people, when they've looked at it, have not been able to pinpoint where it took place. Well, it originally, when Rai Sahib Pandit Sri Krishan began, it began in the Lahore Central Jail, which in 1964 was demolished by the Lahoris. So we have no way to commemorate his cell or the place where he was tried. And thereafter, it is shifted to Poonch House, which again, people don't know about, but Poonch House is actually in the Anarkali grounds in the Lahore Civil Secretariat. It's named after the Maharaja of Poonch, and it's a building that's there. And people often think, well, it must have been in some court building, but it wasn't. But that's where it happens. Now, here is the thing about the trial I want to tell you. When the trial begins on the 10th July 1929, it runs for 10 months. 230 witnesses are called. There are 677, and then suddenly it stops. And it stops because up in the hills of Shimla, during his summer vacation, the Viceroy of India, Lord Irwin, decides at the stroke of a pen to invoke the Lahore Ordinance number 3 of 1931 and to shift on the 1st of May 1931 the entire trial from before a magistrate, before a regular magistrate, into a special tribunal. In this magistrate's court, there would have been, as is still the case in India, upon conviction of death, a right of appeal to the High Court. And the High Court would have said either that, all the witnesses were not heard, or they were heard, or something went wrong, and they can either uphold it or they can repeal the decision. Once you move the entire trial into an extrajudicial body, there is no right of appeal to the High Court. And what is this body? Now, here is something which really hasn't been said quite emphatically. I pay tribute to Mr. Noorani, much aged, I think in his 90s now, living in Mumbai, who wrote one of the best books on this, who also, his book is called The Trial of Bhagat Singh, refers to this. But the point here is to note this: there was simply no capacity in the ordinance to instigate or to conceive a judicial tribunal. It just didn't exist. What the Parent Act says, Section 72 of the Government of India Act says this, very easy to understand. Section 72, the Government of India may, in cases of emergency, make and promulgate ordinances for the peace and good governance of India. And any ordinance so made shall, for the space of not more than 6 months, have the force of law. Now, where is the emergency? Where is the requirement of peace and good governance? These are 25 men who are in jail. They have not absconded. They are facing a regular court. They are brought out of cells every morning. They're put back. Where is the emergency? Where is the need of peace and good government? Most people have stopped there. I go one further. I say, well, think about this actually. This ordinance is an emergency ordinance. It is to be invoked at times like, for example, like in Bengal during the colonial days, there were famines. If a famine arises and you've got to take emergency measures that threatens the organized life of the community, by an ordinance, you can say, everyone stay at home, nobody can come out between the hours of 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock. All right? There's an emergency and it's for peace and good governance because every time the food arrives, people go rushing for the food. I'm going to call this, but after 6 months, I must return normalcy back again. How can you create a judicial tribunal for a 6-month period? How can you do it in this case where 230 witnesses have been called, 457 witnesses have yet to be called, and you've got to do this in the next 6 months? It took Pandit Sri Krishan 10 months to do 230 witnesses. He now has, the new tribunal now has just 6 months in which to hear 427. Impossible to do. If it's impossible to do, you can't create the tribunal. The tribunal is only, again, rioting goes on. Let's say currently terrible situation in India, as in most parts of the world with the coronavirus and so on. If rioting happens for the seizure of canisters of oxygen and the like and so on, the government may invoke the ordinance where they don't have regular powers because there's an emergency to maintain peace and good governance, but only for 6 months. That's why it's an emergency measure. After 6 months, you must bring regular law back into operation again. There is no capacity in this to create a tribunal for a hearing, a tribunal where people are going to be hanged after it. Now, if I'm right about that, and these people were extrajudicially unlawfully hanged, what is the consequence of that? Well, I leave that up to you to decide, not for me to decide. I can only tell you this, that in Lahore, I discovered that on 3rd February 2016, a petition was presented before the High Court in Lahore to set aside the decision on the hanging of Bhagat Singh and his comrades, that this was unlawful. So he was unlawfully killed. Now, here's another example of why he was unlawfully killed. Within a week, the tribunal runs into difficulties. What happens is the tribunal, headed by Justice Coldstream, a week later, the revolutionaries walk in. Now, all revolutionaries in all the cases, Meerut trial, all of them, had this habit of coming in and singing a revolutionary song. And after all, when you think about it, Ram Prasad Bismil and the others were renowned poets. Sarfaroshi ki tamanna ab hamare dil mein hai, and they had these poetic songs that they would sing. And before the trial would begin, they would hold hands, they would sing the song, shout Inqilab Zindabad, and then the trial would begin. The singing and the slogans would not interfere with the proper conduct of the trial at all. And that happened every time. And it happened before Pandit Sri Kishan as well. But Justice Coldstream takes an exception to this. He says, no, you can't sing this song. He orders the police to beat them up. I wonder how any judge worth his salt would allow that kind of disorder to occur in his court. But these people are beaten, they're thrown over the benches, they're rendered unconscious, bruised and so on and so forth. And they say, look, we're not going to come to court tomorrow. We demand an apology. So now the court can't proceed. There's an Indian judge who is completely forgotten. One of the leading films on this, of course, was Manoj Kumar's Shaheed, made in 1965, where it took 4 years to make that film. And he went and talked to Bhagat Singh's mother and all the others, and he wept with her, he cried with her and so on. But even he shows 3 English judges, and the Indian judge is forgotten because Aga Haider, he has family both on the Indian side and on the Pakistani side. In fact, Irfan Habib, the leading intellectual in India, is a very distant relative of his. And I met some other relatives of his in Lahore as well. And Aga Haider said, I'm not going to agree to an order of their being beaten and so on. And when on the night the prosecutor went and saw him at his home, he told the prosecutor bluntly to his face, he said, I'm a judge, not a butcher, and threw him out. So what happens 2 weeks afterwards is this: Aga Haider has to go because he's had the effrontery to refuse to go along with the beating. So he is sacked. Justice Coldstream has to go because he actually undertook a beating of people in his own court, and those people will not turn up to court anymore. Now, why is that important? For this reason. Here is a capital charge of 3 people who are going to be sentenced to death for a conspiracy against the crown. But of the court, of the 3 judges, only 1 has heard all the evidence. The other 2 have been sacked and they haven't heard the evidence. How can you then go on to do a death penalty verdict on the basis of evidence heard only by 1 judge? Right? 2 other judges come in, but they haven't heard all the evidence. So the whole thing is completely preposterous. And to suggest that the rule of law was being followed is absolutely ridiculous, quite frankly. All right. Now, I've just recently been sent by one consequence of my writing the book is that people have been writing to me. And someone brought to my attention a telegram written by the Home Secretary in New Delhi directly to the Home Minister in Punjab, saying to him that you must hang them earlier. Don't hang them in the morning. Normally, hangings take place at dawn, but at 7 p.m. at night. Now, again, that's improper. I've seen the telegram. Why is that political interference there taking place to hang someone who's already being, sentenced? So that again is terribly troubling. So that's the first thing I want to say about the execution. What the consequences will be thereafter is something for you to determine. The second thing I just want to say in the time I've got left is, why is Bhagat Singh important? Now again, we've forgotten about him. When he talks about revolution, so what happens is this: on the 8th of April, when he is arrested after throwing 2 smoke bombs, the irony here is this, that after shooting after avenging Lala Lajpat Rai's death, he escapes. He escapes on a train from Lahore and heads for Calcutta towards Hare. and the police haven't got the slightest idea who the killers were. I've looked at telegrams and other information where they even after a identification parade, they have no idea who the killers were. And Bhagat Singh would have gotten clean away with this because nobody had any idea, except that 4 months later, Bhagat Singh comes back all the way from Bengal to take part in the central legislative bombing, where he throws 2 smoke bombs that are designed not to hurt anyone, throws those bombs and then surrenders himself together with B.K. Dutt and says, I want to make a statement as to why we're doing this. So this idea that they were revolutionaries or violent is incorrect, because here is a very sophisticated aspect of his methodology as to how he proceeds in informing the authorities about what he stands for. Now, so on the 8th of April, he's arrested immediately, and this is quite well accurately shown in Manoj Kumar's film, actually quite well shown, still available on black and white on the YouTube, well worth looking at, accurate in many other respects. And then he is tried once again before a regular judge in the Sessions Court. Now, when he goes in the Sessions Court, that's on the 6th of June, 1929. And thereafter, there is an appeal on the 12th of June, 1929. On both those days, he makes speeches before the court to explain what he's about. And those are the only 2 speeches he's ever made before the authorities. And they're worth looking at because we've forgotten them. Of those 2, the most important is the 6th of June, 1929. And he says this, and this will startle many people, but shows the depth of his understanding. He says that by revolution, we do not mean, quote, the cult of the bomb or the pistol. So it's not the bomb or the pistol at all. And it is not an excuse for, quote, individual vendetta, unquote. But, quote, by revolution, we mean that the present order of things, which is based on manifest injustice, must change. Arey, ye beinsafi hai that is fighting against. He's not fighting against anything else. He's fighting against manifest injustice. Yeah, and this idea that you've got, and I in fact go so far as to say that in many ways, the Gandhian approach is much, much more simplistic. For Gandhi, non-violence is a fetish. It's almost like a prayer. It's like a solemn undertaking that he has to make. With Bhagat Singh, it is far, far more sophisticated. And you look at it, and you know why that's the case, because Gandhi draws from mystical doctrines of Hinduism. Bhagat Singh is much, much more widely read. He draws from Lafayette, Garibaldi, George Washington, from the Marathi Shivaji, from the Sikh Guru Gobind Singh, who he sees as a revolutionary. And he draws upon people like that. And so it's much, much more complicated than what we've been given to understand. And on the 12th of June, when he appeals to the High Court against the sentence, at that stage, the sentence is only that he's going to be transported to, deported out of the country, because at that stage, they don't know that he had shot Saunders. It's only when they just find out he shot Saunders that they're now trying for murder. That's when he's hanged. So at that stage, there's just an appeal against transportation. On the 12th of June, he goes before the High Court judge. And again, he says, listen to the words, quote, the sword of revolution is to be sharpened on the whetting stone of ideas, unquote. It's the ideas that matter to him. It's not just the sword, it's the ideas. Right? So that's, and as a result of that, the High Court judge, Justice Ford, describes him as a quote, unquote, a sincere revolutionary, unquote, a sincere revolutionary. Now, second thing I want to say about him is, what does he mean by, if it's not the cult of the bomb and the pistol, what was he fighting for? Well, again, there are so many writings. I mean, he read 300 books while he was in jail. The Dwarka Das Library struggled to supply him with books, such was his demand. He wrote over 150 documents. He wrote 50 letters. There are scores of pamphlets, gazettes, and documents of that kind. And in it, you get an insight into what he stands for. And one of my favorites is this. He says that we need a revolution. And I would say, would we not want the same revolution today in India or anywhere else indeed, the producers or the laborers, in spite of being the most necessary element of society, are robbed by the exploiters of the fruits of their labor and deprived of their elementary rights. Who wants to be deprived of their elementary rights? And then he goes on to give us 3 examples. Quote, the peasant who grows corn for all starves with his family, unquote. Second, the weaver who supplies the world market with textile fabrics cannot find enough to cover his own and his children's bodies, unquote. Third, the masons, smiths, and carpenters who rear magnificent palaces live and perish in slums, unquote. That's what he's fighting for. Now, I'm not a historian. And as I say, I came to this as a lawyer, and it has been a recent movement for me. But I wonder whether there are Gandhian politicians or Gandhi himself or others in the Congress party who had words of that kind to say in the same way. In the same way. And even when he dies, one of his great followers is, of course, Subhash Chandra Bose. And Subhash Chandra Bose reads out a letter. This is 2 days before he dies. He reads out a letter to the young political workers. And the letter says this: I am not a terrorist. I'm a revolutionary who has got definite ideas of a lengthy program, unquote. But that's his own words. And when you look at even the small amount of information I've given, you can see that he's not a terrorist. He's not the kind of terrorist you see today in Iraq with ISIS or Taliban and so on, who just blow up people. And that's all they do. It's much, much more sophisticated than that. And just lastly, before I end, one other thing I've quoted is this: a day before he dies on the 22nd of March, he writes this. He says, the desire to live is natural. It is in me also. I do not want to conceal it, but it is conditional. I do not want to live as a prisoner or under restrictions. Yet one thing pricks me even today. My heart nurtured some ambitions for doing something for humanity and for my country. I have not been able to fulfill even 1,000th part of these ambitions. If I live, I might perhaps get a chance to fulfill them. If ever it came to my mind that I should not die, it came from this end only, unquote. You see, otherwise he was happy to die. And it's only because he had a definite program. He wanted to do things, and his writings are on constitutional reform, on the parliamentary system. Let me just end by saying this. What have we lost? Well, what we've lost is this. Had Bhagat Singh lived, and this is the thing that pricks me, would Indian politics have been different? Certainly he would have had a share of his political position alongside Nehru and the others. Because the fact is that he was, up to the point of his death, the most popular Indian politician, even more than Gandhi himself, all right? What we've lost is this, that as a result of Gandhian politics and what's happened, what we've ended up doing is appeasing and appealing to caste and communal vote banks, which have reared their head once again in India. Casteism and communalism are feudal forces. For those of us who are able to live in the West will tell you that these are feudal forces. And what the path of Gandhi, tremendous a figure as he is, and in many ways, the Indian name and Indian reputation has for decades hung on the name of Mahatma Gandhi. But the path of Gandhi has actually ended up dividing India upon caste and communal lines. Had Bhagat Singh lived and had his path and his brand of politics triumphed, it would have been a path towards the elimination of poverty, of unemployment, and all the other evils, access to universal health care, access to free education, access to housing, all those things that a developed nation aspires to. And I think that's a possibility that we cannot exclude as we look at these rival traditions. What has ended up happening is simply the supplanting of one form of colonial rule by a form of other elitist rule from the Indians themselves. And for a long time, we were very happy just to be free, just to be independent. But I think the time has come when we must ask whether that is any longer enough. With those words, I must end. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor Juss. We have a few questions. Let me ask you some of them. Following on the lines of what you said on your extensive comments about Gandhi, Apurna Khastagir is asking, I wonder what was Gandhi's role against the setting up of this tribunal?
Well, that is unknown. It would be wrong for me to say that he had a role in this. What I can say, and this is a point of contention, is this, that Gandhi himself in his own book, Young India, says in his own words that when he was negotiating with Irvin, remember in the 1930s, from 1930, there were 3 roundtable conferences taking place. When he was negotiating with Lord Irvin, he says, I could have made commutation a condition of my negotiation, but I chose not to do so. He did not demand that these 3 young men should be simply sentenced to life imprisonment or sent for transportation. In fact, the more controversial thing is that he went on to say, eventually, that if the boys are to hang, let they be hanged before the Lahore, the Karachi Congress. So they were hanged then 4 days before the Karachi Congress.
Did you really say that?
Yes, that's right. That is correct. Now, what I would simply say is this, that look, it's not for me to get into the controversy. All I would say is this, that if you are a leader of the country, what are the expectations of the people upon you? Are they not at the very least that you say to the person you're negotiating with that, look, I know he's committed murder. I know he himself admits he's done it, but we are now on the verge of independence. And as a condition of your granting this to me, I want this man to be spared his life. That is what we would have expected. Whether that would have happened is in the lap of the gods. We don't know, but it's something that one would have expected of our leader. That I can say.
Right. The next question from Vishwajit. Do you have a list of lawyers defending Sardar Bhagat Singh in the trials? And maybe I can add on to that if you could say something about the defense lawyers.
Sorry, they say what, sorry?
Do you have a list of lawyers defending Sardar Bhagat Singh in these trials? To which I wanted to add on a little more, if you could say something about the lawyers rather than just the...
Yes, of course. Yeah, a very good point. In fact, while I was writing the book, I came across the names. There were 5 or 6 lawyers that came in to represent Bhagat Singh and the others. And many of them did it without any fees being paid. Many of them were treated with great disrespect by the authorities. One person was a man by the name of Amolak Ram Kapoor. Amolak Ram Kapoor, I tell his story because, in fact, I also print out his diary in the book. I got information about him from his granddaughter who lives in Delhi, who in turn got information about him from his daughter, the aged daughter living in Delhi. And these people who I printed out, published, in fact, the bills where they put the bills before the government to say, I need to be paid 40 rupees for the work I've done on this. And they really struggle with this. Asaf Ali was, again, one of the lawyers that represented him as well. And he went on subsequently. In 1950, he made a speech in India to say that the names of people like Bhagat Singh, which were household names, until a few years ago, now stand to be forgotten. And we must do something about this. And Asaf Ali then went on to become the Indian High Commissioner in Washington. So highly respected he was. But many of them, again, their stories need to be told. I mean, I'm sure there's a book to be written on this. If I could discover who they were, I would love to look at what papers they have or exist in their families. I'd love to go through those, because again, after partition, many of them came across the border. They went on to have, like Kapoor Sahib himself, was a flourishing practitioner in Delhi and in Shimla as well. And there's is again a story that really needs to be told. Balbir Singh is another person that also represented these people, but at great cost to themselves and often at great risk to their careers.
Right. Dr. Julie Banerjee Mehta asking you to comment on the recent historical interest in scholarship to uncover the importance of history from different perspectives. She is particularly thinking of your intertextuality with Edward Said's theory, the idea of marginal and alternative histories resisting and defying with great force the hegemony and brutality of one narrative. I mean, if you could just comment on this.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, what I would say here is this, that you know, one other point I make in the book is that a figure that is quite well known, and there is a new book to come out in his name, is the revolutionary Algerian who fought against the French by the name of France. And he, Frantz Fanon wrote a book in 1961, The Wretched of the Earth. And he says that decolonization is necessarily a violent process, because the very act of decolonizing means that you've got to dislodge a governing elite and supplant it with your own elite. And so necessarily nobody's going to give way. You're going to have recourse to violence, the idea of violence. And I looked at that and I thought, look, he is writing 30 to 40 years after Bhagat Singh. Why is he known so well, but Bhagat Singh completely unknown in the West? Completely unknown. I mean, no one knows of him at all, you know, because he also talked about the necessity for violence as a decolonizing process. And in his writings, he says that. And so I think, again, this idea of narratives and of forgotten histories is critically important for us to bring alive. And it falls on us, because I often make the point, we are the custodians of our own narratives. If we don't own them up, and if we don't tell our stories, nobody else will. And if somebody else will, they will tell the wrong story, the erroneous story. They will supplant a narrative like the one I've just been talking about, which is in fact a skewed up narrative. So it's really very, very important for us to do that, simply because facts are powerful forces. You can ignore them for 10, 15, 20 years, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. Eventually, facts are facts, and you've got to own up to them. And you've got to face them. And what I'm telling you are facts. And we've got to face up to them.
From Rajiv Sethi, and I'm going to have one more question with that. Rajiv Sethi is asking, do you think an apology from the British would be appropriate? Of course, they may have to apologize to half the countries of the world. And second, a comment from Rishika Ray. Sir, I believe that no amount of reparations would be enough. Would you take these two together?
Okay. Look, this is a subject on which I'm no more qualified than yourself to speak about. Should there be an apology? Should there be reparations? We do know that apologies and reparations have become the flavor of the day. You know, one has been demanded for the Jallianwala Bagh. The Archbishop of Canterbury from England did go to Amritsar and give an apology for the Amritsar massacre. The Prime Minister did not. The Prime Minister simply expressed regret. And when he was asked, he said, look, this is quote unquote work in progress. My view on this is this, that certainly apologies are important if there are living beings still alive, relatives who you need to apologize to. But if the relatives are no more, who are you apologizing to? Who is apologizing and who is he apologizing to? And what about our own sins in the matter? What about our own failings at the time and subsequently? And the reason I say that is this: there's a wonderful word that the Germans have developed to deal with their own past, the Holocaust, where they, had been guilty of the gas chambers and so forth. And the word is Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Vergangenheitsbewältigung means coming to terms with our past, reckoning and facing up to the things that we did wrong and making sure that that doesn't happen, and to search into our souls and to find some kind of a manner in which we can rehabilitate ourselves. And I asked this question, and I'm sorry if this sounds contentious and controversial. Are we in a position to ask for an apology given what we are ourselves doing at the moment?
Right.
I just do that.
Yeah. Again, two questions which I'm clubbing together. One from Smita Basu. Do you think that Bhagat Singh's popularity made it essential for some Indians to have him out of the way, and hence they played their cards quite well in influencing the British? And another question from one Mr. Mitra, which is more direct. For sure, Gandhi would have done all he could to deny Bhagat Singh any position of influence.
Well, let me take the second one first. Look, there is no doubt about it. The two were rivals, and the two represented rival traditions. And one of the things about the Congress Party was that whilst they were fighting for independence, there were also actually people who were benefiting from colonialism. Many of them were in cahoots with them. And I say that whilst recognizing, much to his great credit, Mahatma Gandhi at the height of the Second World War called for quit India. To his great credit, he did that. So I give him that. But they were also benefiting in that way. The revolutionaries were not. Jatin Das was not. Right? People like Jogendranath Chatterjee, they were not. And so they were rivals. And in many ways, the short answer is this: Gandhi stood to benefit from the removal from the scene of Bhagat Singh. That is not to say that he was actually trying to kill him. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that he benefited. But what the record is clear upon is that he did not ask for commutation when he could have, of a person of a stature of Bhagat Singh at the time.
All right, let's finish with this question from the other end of the spectrum, if I might call that. Is there any material on record of Bhagat Singh having interacted or having been influenced by Veer Savarkar?
By? No, all right, Veer Savarkar, yeah, okay. No, he did read about Veer Savarkar. He did read about him, but he wasn't overly influenced by him. He read about him and wrote about him even in much the same way that he wrote about every other revolutionary leader. All the others that had met with martyrdom, he wrote about. But he wasn't actually enamored by Veer Savarkar, a man who in his, 84 years had given 6 apologies to the British.
Yes. All right, thank you so much for this very fascinating, very illuminating evening. May I call upon my colleague on the library committee, Professor Chaitali Moitro, to give the official vote of thanks, please.
Good evening, everybody. It is absolutely rewarding to hear from a prolific scholar about a historical event which develops into historiography. And the president, the members of the library subcommittee of Bengal Club, the chairpersons, all join me in thanking profusely Professor Satvinder Singh Juss for this illuminating talk, which will be food for thought for all of us. Thank you very much. Thanks due to my colleague, Sri Sarojesh Mukherjee, and the organizers of this talk. Thanks to Guru Das for being in the technical end to see things complete. Thank you all for participating in this talk today. Goodbye and good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. Thank
I'll
you.
mail you the YouTube links. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.